The night shift nurse moved through Riverside Community's emergency department at 11:48 p.m. with the kind of efficiency that made her invisible. Sarah Chen didn't hurry. She didn't linger. She existed in the spaces between the fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell of a place where people arrived broken and left either fixed or gone. 23 beds. 42 staff members across 3 shifts. 17 years coordinating medical evacuations across 3 war zones, and nobody at this hospital knew her name was actually on a Pentagon roster under the call sign Valkyrie. Her badge clipped to faded navy scrubs read RN, night shift, with a photograph taken 5 years ago, before the grey at her temples had spread far enough to be noticeable, before the scar along her left collarbone had faded to the color of old rope. She carried a stethoscope in her pocket and a broken dog tag on a chain hidden beneath her scrubs, the metal cold against her sternum, a constant weight that reminded her why she was here in Denver pretending to be a nurse at all. The mission parameters were clear: monitor the veteran treatment program for an opioid diversion pattern. Naval intelligence suspected someone inside Riverside Community was siphoning controlled substances before they reached the patients who needed them. 17 patients in 6 months had complained about missing doses. 3 had overdosed anyway, which meant they were getting pills from somewhere else. The leak was institutional. The leak was internal. The leak was why Sarah Chen had left the teams and buried herself in scrubs instead of a flight suit. She pushed through the double doors into Trauma Bay 4, where the night shift resident was setting up an 4-line on an elderly patient with a respiratory infection. The resident didn't look up. None of them did, not really. She was the older Asian nurse who worked nights and didn't complain and made excellent coffee in the break room at 2 a.m. The invisible part was working perfectly. Until Bay 7 admitted its 8 p.m. patient transfer. The report came through at 9:15 p.m. Marcus Webb, 32-year-old male, post-operative day from a wound drainage procedure on his left arm. Green Beret. Recent deployment cycle. Admitted for complications, fever of 101.2 degrees and localized edema around the surgical site that suggested possible infection settling in. The surgeon had packed the wound with antibiotic gauze and scheduled follow-up assessment for the morning. Standard protocol. Routine recovery. Nothing remarkable. Sarah read the chart while standing at the nursing station, and her hands went still for exactly 2.3 seconds. She knew this because the monitor alarm in Bay 3 was beeping once per second, and she counted 1, 2, 3. By the 4th beep, she'd moved past it. By the 5th, she'd pulled Marcus Webb's complete file and scanned for next of kin, known associates, medical history before his current service. The face in his admission photograph was a man's face now. Strong jaw. Scar tissue along his right eyebrow from something that had healed badly. Eyes the color of burned amber, looking directly at the camera with the flat, guarded expression of someone who had learned not to show pain. She had seen those same eyes 20 years ago in a child's face, 8 years old, covered in dust and blood from a firefight in the Hindu Kush that had killed his father in front of him. Sarah moved to Bay 7 without consciously deciding to move. Her legs carried her forward the way they did when her hands needed to perform a procedure she'd done 1,000 times. The curtain slid open with a soft whisper of metal rings on aluminum rod. Marcus Webb was sitting up in the bed, reading something on his phone, and he looked up with the automatic attention someone learns in special operations when a person enters their space. "Evening," he said. His voice was deeper than she expected, but she had no baseline to measure against. She hadn't heard his voice in 2 decades. "Checking your dressing," Sarah said. She didn't offer her name. The chart said RN on the badge, and that was enough. She moved to the 4-line and checked the drip rate, 55 mils per hour, and the fluid bag showed 680 mils remaining. His vitals were on the monitor: heart rate 87, blood pressure 118/74, oxygen saturation 98%. The fever was down to 100.8 degrees since admission. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I got stabbed and they're making me sit here instead of letting me go back to work," Marcus said. There was humor in it, but underneath was the restlessness she'd seen in soldiers 1,000 times. The body wanted to move. The body wanted to be useful. Sitting in a hospital bed felt like dying by other means. She touched the gauze dressing on his arm, checking for seepage. Clean. The wound was responding well to the packing. She adjusted the monitor leads and noted the time in her head, 9:27 p.m. 43 minutes until Dr. Gabriel arrived for evening rounds. The surgeon will clear you soon, she said. For days post-op and the infection markers are already trending down. You been a nurse long? Marcus asked. Long enough, Sarah said. She was checking his other arm now, the one without the surgical site, the forearm where a soldier's watch would sit. He was wearing a standard-issue Garmin Fortrex military GPS watch with the band replaced with tactical nylon. Same watch she'd seen 1,000 times in the field. Same watch his father had probably worn before the ambush in the Jolin district that killed him when this boy was 8 years old. You move like you know what you're doing, Marcus said. Most nurses treat the fall like they're defusing a bomb. You just check it. Practice, Sarah said. She didn't offer more. She finished the assessment, recorded her findings on the chart, and was moving toward the curtain when he spoke again. Did you ever serve? He asked. It was a casual question, the way soldiers ask each other. They could smell it on people sometimes, the thing that separated the civilians from the ones who had actually been somewhere. Sarah's hand paused on the curtain edge. Different lifetime, she said. She meant it as truth and lie in equal measure. She didn't wait for him to respond. She moved back to the nursing station and placed the chart in the electronic system, noting the fever trend, the adequate pain control, the psychological resilience of a patient who should have been more anxious about a post-operative infection but instead was thinking about when he could return to duty. 8-year-old Marcus Webb, the boy she had pulled from rubble while rounds were impacting the dust around them, the boy she had given her own blood unit to because the helicopters were still 40 minutes out, had become the kind of soldier who was ready to kill or die tomorrow if anyone asked. She didn't know him. He didn't know her. The broken dog tag under her scrubs felt heavier than it had at the start of her shift. At 10:04 p.m., Dr. Gabriel arrived for evening rounds. Sarah heard his shoes before she saw him, polished leather clicking against tile with the rhythm of someone accustomed to authority moving through spaces designed to defer to him. His tie was still perfectly knotted. His white coat was still pristine. He had been at Riverside Community for 7 years and had built a reputation on 3 things: surgical competence, board connections, and the ability to make junior staff feel stupid without technically raising his voice. Chen, he said, though it wasn't a greeting. It was a name pronounced as a noun, a thing rather than a person. Sarah was charting medications for a post-operative PTSD patient in Bay 2, a former Army Ranger, name of Hector Martinez, admitted 3 days ago for acute anxiety response and combat nightmares. The attending had ordered a stat dose of sedatives, which meant immediate administration, which meant Sarah was calculating the 2 mg midazolam dose and preparing the 4 push when Dr. Gabriel appeared over her shoulder. Before you give that, she said, not looking away from the syringe she was drawing, we haven't done a proper neurological baseline. If we sedate him first, we won't know if the confusion is from the anxiety or something else. We should assess for. The order is stat, Chen, Gabriel said. His voice made the air in the medication room feel thinner. That means now. Not after you decide to practice medicine. Sarah stopped drawing. She turned to look at him directly, which was a mistake. Looking directly at someone like Gabriel gave him permission to see you, and being seen by him was the first step toward being targeted. She should have continued with the sedative, should have apologized, should have made herself smaller. Instead, she said, with respect, Doctor, a stat sedative without baseline neuroassessment means we're treating the symptom instead of the underlying cause. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Gabriel smiled. It was a smile like a shark showing its teeth, all mouth and no warmth. You've been here 3 years as a night shift nurse, he said. I've been practicing medicine for 22. I'll handle the underlying causes. You'll handle the 4, or you'll explain to HR why you're refusing orders from your attending. Sarah felt her jaw clench. She felt the muscle in her left shoulder tighten. She felt the part of her brain that had been trained in interrogation recognize that she was being tested, being marked, being sized up by someone who enjoyed the moment when subordinates realized they didn't have any choice. "Of course, doctor," she said. She turned back to the syringe and finished the draw. She moved to Bay 2 where Hector Martinez was curled on his side, sweat-soaked from the night terrors that had plagued him since the explosion that killed his spotter 3 years ago. She found his full line, prepped it with alcohol, and pushed the medication in steady increments. The sedative took effect in 47 seconds. His breathing slowed. His body stopped trembling. By minute 2, he was asleep. Gabriel was standing in the doorway when she exited the bay. "The next time you question my orders in front of staff, we'll have a conversation with administration present," he said. "You understand?" "Yes, doctor," Sarah said. She didn't look at him. She moved past him toward the charting station, her movements practiced and smooth and carrying none of the adrenaline that was moving through her system like electricity. The broken dog tag felt even heavier now. When she glanced back, Gabriel was already moving on to the next patient, his attention already dividing itself between the next authority challenge, the next opportunity to remind someone of their place in the hierarchy. He had no idea he had just made a tactical error. He had no idea that Sarah Chen had just mentally upgraded his threat level and begun cataloging his patterns. By 11:32 p.m., the ER had settled into the rhythm of deep night. Most critical patients were stable. The waiting room was down to 2 people. The fluorescent lights buzzed their constant electric hum, and somewhere in the building, a clock ticked toward midnight, toward the next shift, toward the moment when Sarah would go back to her apartment with the walls bare and the refrigerator empty and the single photograph of her son Daniel, 16 years old and looking so much like his father it hurt to see it. But first, she had to finish her rounds. She had to check on Marcus Webb in Bay 7 one more time before shift change, assess his fever trend, make sure the infection markers were truly declining and this wasn't the beginning of something worse. She pulled his chart and read the notes. Vitals stable. Wound appearance unchanged. Patient alert and oriented to person, place, time, and situation. No new complaints of pain beyond the expected post-operative discomfort. She didn't expect what happened next to change everything. The room went dead silent. Dr. Gabriel stood at the whiteboard during morning rounds, his Patek Philippe catching the fluorescent light as he gestured at Sarah with the marker like a conductor silencing an orchestra. 12 residents and 4 attending physicians filled the conference room at Riverside Community Hospital in Denver, and every single one of them turned to watch the night shift nurse walk forward. Gabriel smiled the way wolves smile before they feed. "Nurse Chen," he said, his voice smooth as expensive bourbon, "since you felt qualified to question my clinical judgment last night, perhaps you can refresh everyone on benzodiazepine pharmacokinetics in traumatic brain injury patients." He handed her the marker like he was handing her a loaded weapon. "Enlighten us." Sarah took one measured breath. She'd stood in operating theaters under fire, had made decisions that meant the difference between sending soldiers home with their limbs or in flag-folded boxes, and she would not give this man the satisfaction of watching her hands shake. She walked to the whiteboard. The marker felt light in her grip, muscle memory from 20 years of briefing Navy commanders was still there, buried under the scrubs and the fake resume and the civilian identity she'd built so carefully. She began to write. Numbers, chemical structures, the cascade of how benzodiazepines metabolize differently in patients with increased intracranial pressure, how the sedation Gabriel had ordered would have masked the deteriorating neurostatus she'd caught in her 2 a.m. assessment. Her handwriting was precise, clinical, authoritative in a way that made 2 of the residents lean forward. Gabriel waited until she finished the 3rd paragraph. Then he interrupted. "That's a textbook answer, Nurse Chen," he said, and the mockery in his voice was a blade wrapped in velvet. "In the real world, in this hospital, we follow the attending physician's orders without playing doctor." He paused. His eyes moved to the residents, making sure they were all watching. "Tell me, where exactly did you get your medical degree? Because your night shift experience doesn't include a license to practice medicine." Someone in the back of the room made a sound that might have been a stifled laugh. Sarah set down the marker. She turned to face him. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were holding their breath, and she let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds before she spoke. Her voice was quiet. Level. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than a single man's ambition. I was reciting contraindications, Doctor. 10 words. Fragments. No apology. No please. The ones you ordered despite them. His jaw tightened. She'd broken the first rule of institutional hierarchy, the one that said subordinates absorb insult in silence. One of the attending physicians cleared his throat. Gabriel moved on to another patient presentation, but his neck had flushed a deep crimson and his hands gripped the tablet tighter than necessary. The morning rounds ended at 8:22 a.m. Sarah was heading toward the elevator bank when Gabriel caught her by the alcove, his arm coming up to block the doors before she could step inside. His cologne was expensive and suffocating in the narrow space, something with notes of cedar and the smell of his own authority. "Let's be clear about something," he said, and his voice had lost the smooth tone from the conference room. This was the voice of a man who was not accustomed to being challenged, who'd built 8 years of directorship on people nodding and complying and never, ever questioning his clinical judgment. Nurses who can't follow protocol find themselves on probation. "I've been ER director here for 8 years. How long have you been on night shift, exactly?" Sarah met his eyes. His pupils were dilated slightly. Anger did that to the human nervous system, a physiological response he probably didn't even know he was displaying. She could read his vitals like a monitor, could predict the trajectory of what he was about to do because she'd spent 17 years learning how men like him thought, how they escalated, where their breaking points lived. "Long enough to know the difference between protocol and shortcuts," she said. His arm dropped. He stepped back, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to speak, and when he finally moved out of the alcove, his eyes held something darker than anger. They held the look of a man whose power had just been questioned by someone he'd already decided was beneath him. That was the moment Sarah knew he wouldn't stop. Men like Gabriel never did. She made it through her shift, through the handoff to day nurses, through the routine of charting and inventory. But when she opened her locker at the end of her 12 hours, the red paint hit her like a physical blow. Night shift ninja. 2 words, spray-painted across her locker door in letters that dripped like blood. The paint was still tacky, still smelled of volatile organic compounds and malice. Inside the locker, hanging exactly where she'd left it, was the photograph her daughter had made for her mother's hospital workspace, a laminated family photo, the only soft thing Sarah let herself keep in the clinical environment of her undercover identity. She was standing there, staring at the vandalism, when Gabriel arrived with 2 security officers. Their radios crackled. Their uniforms made everything official, made the humiliation official, made it documented and filed and permanent. "Vandalism of hospital property," Gabriel said, not looking at her, addressing his comment to the security guards as if she were a thing rather than a person. "We'll need to document this for the disciplinary file." He pulled out his tablet, already composing the incident report with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who knew exactly how to weaponize policy. "Nurse Chen, you'll need to step aside while we photograph the locker." Sarah didn't move. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She was thinking about the dog tag hanging beneath her scrubs, about the name engraved on it, about the 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from the Hindu Kush who was now sleeping in Bay 7 with a post-operative wound that needed monitoring and a father he'd never see again. She looked at Gabriel. One measured breath. Then she let a single tear trace down her cheek, not because she was broken, but because she understood exactly what he was trying to do, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. "My daughter made me that family photo inside," she said quietly. Her voice didn't crack. Her hand didn't tremble. "May I retrieve it, or are you confiscating memories too?" The security guards exchanged a glance. One of them shifted his weight, uncomfortable. Gabriel's pen paused over his tablet for half a second, a microsecond of hesitation, before he recovered and began documenting the scene with careful, methodical photographs. He was competent, she realized. That was what made him dangerous. He wasn't just a bully who yelled, he was a man who knew exactly how to use institutional power, who understood that humiliation was most effective when it was systematic, documented, official. Sarah retrieved the photograph while they documented the vandalism. She placed it carefully in her bag, alongside her phone and her keys and the small dog tag on a broken chain that she wore beneath her scrubs where no one could see it. Where no one could ask questions about why a night shift nurse at a Denver hospital was carrying military memorabilia. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when she returned to the patient care areas to check on Marcus Webb one final time before leaving, and she found him awake, his monitors showing normal vitals, his post-operative pain controlled, his consciousness clear and present. He looked at her as she approached, and his eyes tracked hers with the kind of awareness that came from a man who'd spent 20 years training to read micro-expressions and body language. "You're good," he said quietly. "At this?" "At nursing." His chest rose and fell beneath the hospital gown. "My dad said the medic who pulled me out of Kuna province was like that. Calm. Just present. Like nothing could rattle her." Sarah checked his dressing without responding, her fingers moving with the precision of 1,000 patient assessments, her mind registering the healing trajectory and the absence of infection markers. Her hand brushed against his arm, and she felt the muscle memory there too, the training, the readiness, the coiled strength of someone who'd spent 20 years preparing for violence. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. She had no idea that the cascade beginning in that moment, the vandalized locker, the wounded green beret, the dog tag beneath her scrubs that connected them both to a mission that had never officially ended, would accelerate toward something that would shatter the carefully constructed cover she'd spent 2 years building. Sarah finished her assessment and turned to leave. That was when Marcus's monitors began to scream. The monitors beat their steady rhythm as Sarah checked the dressing on Marcus Webb's shoulder wound. Routine post-op assessment. A bone chip removal from the initial trauma had left a surgical site that looked clean, healing on schedule. She made notes in his chart, professional and methodical, the way a night nurse should move through a ward at 3 in the morning. No one was watching. No one cared. Just another veteran getting standard care at Riverside Community. "You knew my father," Marcus said. "Not a question." Sarah's hand froze on the clipboard. She turned back to the bed slowly, every muscle controlled. Marcus wasn't looking at her directly, his eyes tracked the fall line, his breathing shallow but steady. Green beret post-op, strong bones, the kind of soldier who wouldn't break easily. 20 years old when he'd been 8 in the Hindu Kush. 28 now. The math worked. The timing worked. But the recognition in his voice didn't match the absence in his gaze. "I don't know what you mean," Sarah said. Her voice stayed level. Clinical. She'd learned how to lie with precision decades ago. Marcus's jaw tightened. "You walked through fire to get me out of there." Kandahar Province. August 2004. "You carried me for 6 kilometers while rounds came down like rain, and when we reached the extraction point, he stopped. Swallowed hard. My father died that day. Before you found us. But you got me out. I remember your voice. I remember it was a woman. I remember you told me your name was Valkyrie." The call light above the bed flickered once. Twice. The fluorescent panels overhead buzzed their mechanical drone, a sound Sarah had learned to filter out during her first week on the night shift. Now it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. "That was a long time ago," Sarah said. Patients sometimes confuse memories with medication side effects. You're post-op from a significant procedure. Your brain is still processing trauma. She reached for his vitals monitor, her movements a shield of professionalism. Pulse 84. Blood pressure 118/72. Temperature 98.6. All normal. All textbook. All lies. "You saved my life twice," Marcus said quietly. "Once in the mountains. Once today on this operating table. I don't know how, but I know it was you." He turned his head toward her then, and his eyes held the certainty of a man who'd spent 2 decades reconstructing a single moment, filing it away, waiting. "Thank you." Sarah's hands moved to his wrist, checking his radial pulse manually. Her fingers were steady. Her heart was not. The pulse beneath her fingertips was strong, regular, the heartbeat of a man who should have died in the desert and didn't, who came back broken and was healing, who somehow recognized her across a chasm of years and lies and wars that had changed them both into versions of themselves they barely recognized. She counted the beats silently. 1, 2, 3, 4. At beat 23, Marcus's body convulsed. The monitor shrieked. One continuous tone. Asystole. No heartbeat. No electrical activity. Just the flatline scream of a heart that had stopped beating entirely, and Sarah's hands were already reaching for the emergency call button while the first cardiac alarm still echoed through the corridor. Gabriel burst through the Bay 7 curtain before the second alarm cycle completed. He moved with the territorial precision of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room, and he was already barking orders before his eyes landed on Marcus's motionless body. "Get me a crash cart. Now. Someone call the surgeon on call, tell him we need him in the OR in 5 minutes, not 20, and if he argues, tell him I'm filing a complaint with the medical board." No one moved. Sarah was already removing Marcus's dressing, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. The sterile field. The collapsed shoulder. The surgical site. Gabriel began external compressions, his hands placed precisely on the center of Marcus's chest, pushing down with controlled force. 30 compressions. 1, 2, 3. The ribs beneath his palms were solid, unyielding. 30 compressions per minute. The rhythm of mechanical death and the attempt to restart it. The crash cart wheeled in, nurses scrambling. Defibrillator pads. For lines. The equipment arranged with the choreographed precision of people who'd rehearsed this dance too many times. Gabriel continued compressions without breaking rhythm, his face reddening with exertion, his breath coming in controlled bursts. "How long?" he demanded. 3 minutes, doctor, one of the residents said. Her voice shook slightly. 3 minutes. The brain begins to die at 4. Sarah stood at the edge of the crash space, hands still gloved, watching Gabriel's technique. Solid compressions. Good depth. His hands were positioned correctly on the sternum, the way a man who'd read all the right journals would position them. But correct wasn't the same as fast enough. Correct wasn't the same as what would save Marcus Webb's life. Gabriel nodded toward the code cart. "Push one of epi. Get me a 12-lead EKG." He didn't look at Sarah. Just continued the compressions, mechanical and measured, like a man following a protocol he'd memorized from continuing education seminars. The adrenaline would be in Marcus's system now. Epinephrine pushing through veins that had seen combat and survival and 20 years of missions that had hardened him into something approaching indestructible. But the heart, even in the strongest men, could fail. Could stop. Could refuse to restart. The surgeons at St. Luke's, the resident said. 17 minutes away. 17 minutes. The gap between life and death, between a man who'd survived the Hindu Kush and a man who would become a name on a memorial. Gabriel's compressions continued. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm like a percussion section played in a funeral march. Sarah stepped forward. The movement was small, deliberate. She positioned herself at the foot of Marcus's bed, where she could see the surgical site clearly, where she could see the dressing she'd removed and the incision beneath it. Her eyes traced the line of the closure. The surgeon's work was clean. Precise. Professional. But there was something wrong with the anatomy. Something about the way the tissue lay. Something about a fragment that shouldn't be visible beneath the surface. A bone shard. Migrating. Working its way through tissue, following the path of least resistance. Following gravity and trauma toward the mediastinum. Following gravity toward the heart. "Doctor," Sarah said. With respect. Gabriel didn't stop compressions. "Not now. There's a fragment migration." Her voice was steady, but the words were clipped short, military shorthand, the way she'd spoken in operating tents with rounds incoming and time being the only enemy that mattered. "The bone's moving toward the cardiac space. Another 2 minutes and it'll perforate the pericardium. He needs a thoracotomy now, not in 17 minutes. Gabriel's hands kept moving. 30 compressions per minute. 1, 2, 3. He didn't even look at her. "You're a nurse. You watch monitors and make observations. You don't diagnose, and you don't tell surgeons how to manage cases. Security is en route to this unit. When they arrive, you're escorted out, and then you're on probation pending a full investigation into your attempt to practice medicine without a license." The room was silent except for the monitor's flatline scream and the wet sound of Gabriel's hands pushing on Marcus's chest. Sarah could feel the eyes on her. The residents frozen in their positions. The nurses waiting for permission to act. The crash cart standing sentinel over a man whose heart had stopped and whose brain was beginning to die at a cellular level that no amount of compressions could reverse. She pulled on a surgical glove from the cart. Then another. She reached for the sterile instrument tray and her fingers found the trauma shears. Clinical scissors. The kind used to cut away clothing, away dressing, away anything that stood between a surgeon's hands and the tissue beneath. Her hands moved to Marcus's chest, just above where Gabriel was still compression. "Stop," she said. Gabriel's hands froze mid-compression. He turned to look at her, and his eyes held the brittle confidence of a man who'd never been contradicted successfully in his entire professional life. "What did you just say to me?" "I said stop compressions." Sarah's voice had dropped an octave. It sounded like authority now. Like something with weight. Like a voice that had given orders in field hospitals and had been obeyed because the alternative was watching people die. "You're wasting time. The fragment is migrating toward his heart. We do a thoracotomy or he's gone. I'm familiar with the procedure." Gabriel straightened up. His face flushed a shade of red that suggested arterial pressure building behind his temples. "You're done. Get security. Remove her from this room. Now." But Sarah was already cutting. The scissors moved through the surgical dressing with a sound like ice cracking. The tissue beneath was clean, exposed, ready. She knew what she was looking for. She'd done this before in conditions where the roof was made of sky and the operating table was sand and the surgical lights were helicopter rotors overhead. In the Hindu Kush. In Syria. In 1,000 places where the choice was between protocol and the heart still beating. "Step back," Sarah said to Gabriel. Not a request. A command. For one moment, a fraction of a second, Gabriel hesitated. The residents watched the moment. The nurses watched. The monitor screamed its flatline song into the silence. Sarah met his eyes with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing the exact percentage of likelihood that a man will survive a sternum opened at the wrong angle by the wrong hands at the wrong time. Gabriel's confidence flickered. Just for a second. But it was enough. He stepped back. Sarah moved into the space he'd vacated. Her hands found the ribs. The anatomical landmarks. The second intercostal space. The spot where the blade would go in cleanly, where the incision would open the chest cavity and give her access to the heart. She reached for the scalpel from the instrument tray, and the blade felt like coming home to a place she'd left 2 decades ago but had never truly abandoned. "Doctor, I need," one of the residents started. "Sponges," Sarah said quietly. "Retractor. And get me a vessel clamp. Now." The room moved. Not because Gabriel had ordered it. Because something in Sarah's voice had shifted, and they recognized it for what it was. The voice of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The voice of someone who'd done this before. The scalpel touched the skin, and Sarah Chen disappeared. What remained was something older. Something that had survived the Hindu Kush and 2 wars and 20 years of night shifts, and a patient who should have died today but wouldn't, not on her watch, not in a room full of residents who were about to watch a protocol be broken and a life be saved simultaneously. The blade moved. Clean. Precise. The kind of precision that comes from hands that have done this thousands of times, that understand tissue and bone and the architecture of human survival at a level that no textbook could teach. The bone fragment was moving. Sarah saw it in her mind before her hands moved, the trajectory, the velocity, the 3 seconds before it reached the left ventricle and stopped Marcus Webb's heart forever. She didn't hesitate. She didn't request permission. The prep happened in her hands like muscle memory unlocking, the scalpel angled precisely between the 5th and 6th ribs, the incision following the natural path of the intercostal space, her movement decisive and certain in a way that made 3 residents step backward in unison. One of them whispered, "That's not a nurse's incision." The sternal retractor spread the chest open. Ribs resisting, then yielding. 60 seconds. Her hands moved faster, harder, the compressions becoming a rhythm that looked impossible to anyone who'd only read about it in textbooks. Dr. Gabriel stood frozen 3 feet away, his mouth slightly open, his mind processing something his training couldn't categorize. This wasn't emergency medicine. This was battlefield surgery. This was the kind of precision that comes from saving lives in the dark while mortars fell. 75 seconds. The residents had stopped moving entirely. 80 seconds. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on Marcus Webb's face, on the pale skin and the slack jaw and the absence of the man who'd looked at her with recognition she hadn't understood yet. 90 seconds. The monitor blipped once. Twice. The rhythm returned, sinus rhythm, strong and urgent, the heart's own electrical system reasserting control under her hands. Sarah felt it before the machine announced it, the shift from clinical death to something resembling life. She held the compression for 3 more beats, reading the response, then withdrew her hands with the same precision she'd brought them in. "Full vitals," she said. Her voice was different now. The night shift nurse was gone. What remained was something the residents recognized from military documentaries and news reports about special operations. The room erupted. Voices overlapping. A resident calling out blood pressure numbers that climbed second by second. A nurse checking the arterial line. The surgical team arriving in a coordinated rush of movement and purpose. Someone, Jennifer, the day shift nurse who'd witnessed everything, whispered to Michael, "Did you see that? That was textbook thoracotomy." "That wasn't textbook," Michael said quietly. "That was trained." Dr. Gabriel moved with practiced efficiency now, directing post-resuscitation care with the cold authority of someone whose competitive instincts had been activated. His hands moved across the monitors and medication drips with professional competence, but his eyes kept returning to Sarah with an expression that looked like the moment a predator realizes it's been hunting something far more dangerous than it assumed. The surgical attending, a man named Chen, no relation, arrived and took over Marcus's care without question, nodding at Sarah once with what looked like recognition of something beyond her credentials. Within 5 minutes, Marcus Webb was stable enough to transfer to the ICU. The monitors moved with him. The ventilator tubing connected to his new position. The surgical attending followed, leaving the bay quiet except for the sound of cleaning supplies and the fluorescent hum. Dr. Gabriel caught Sarah in the hallway outside the trauma bay. His voice was low and controlled, the kind of control that meant fury living underneath. "That was the most reckless, unauthorized procedure I've witnessed in 20 years. You just ended your career." He stepped closer, his position blocking the corridor. A nurse performing direct cardiac massage without surgical credentials. Without authorization. Without so much as asking for permission. "That's not medicine, Sarah. That's insubordination." Sarah's jaw clenched. 1 breath. 2. She didn't respond because responding would be admitting something her cover couldn't afford to admit. "I'm filing critical incident reports," Gabriel continued. "Unauthorized procedures. Operating outside scope of practice. Potential harm to the patient through improper training. He pulled his phone out, already moving. I'm calling Dr. Patricia Voss on the hospital board. We're scheduling an emergency review of your credentials. Tonight. The next 2 hours moved like a system shutting down. Gabriel made his call from his office with the door closed but his voice carrying through the walls. Sarah heard fragments, master-level surgical technique, completely unauthorized, appears to have received advanced medical training somewhere, but not through any civilian nursing program. Dr. Voss's response came through his phone speaker, unacceptable. We need documentation of her entire educational background. Where did she get that training? By 3 a.m., critical incident reports had been filed. By 3:56 a.m., security had been called. By 4:15 a.m., an administrator appeared at Sarah's locker with a document stating that her building access was suspended pending a formal review of her credentials and licensing. The words "potential fraud" appeared 3 times on the paperwork. But Gabriel's real move came in the hours before dawn. He appeared in the staffing office with a list and began reassigning. Jennifer, who'd watched Marcus's heart restart under Sarah's hands and who'd whispered about textbook incisions, transferred to pediatrics day shift, effective immediately. Michael, who'd made the comment about trained hands, reassigned to orthopedics. Susan from the night shift, who'd handled the surgical instruments and moved with the coordination of someone who'd seen this before, sent to night float rotating through different departments. Marcus's ICU nurse, who'd stood in the bay and witnessed everything, moved to a different hospital entirely, cited as a staffing rebalance. Isolation. Systematic, calculated isolation. The witnesses scattered. Their testimonies separated. Their accounts rendered useless in any formal review because they wouldn't be available at the same time, in the same room, telling the same story. Sarah packed her locker at 5:51 a.m. The shadow box containing her Navy Cross and Silver Star was at home, forbidden territory for 17 years of cover. Her nursing credentials, her Colorado license, her years of night shifts at Riverside Community, all of it going into a single cardboard box that weighed almost nothing despite representing 2 years of meticulous infiltration and investigation. The opioid diversion ring was still operating in the veteran treatment program. 3 state lines worth of trafficking. Names. Dates. Supply chain documentation that she'd gathered piece by piece and never reported because her mission parameters demanded she stay invisible until the network became large enough to prosecute at federal level. The escort to her car was humiliating precisely because it wasn't humiliating. The security guard was polite. Professional. He didn't look at her with contempt or triumph. He simply walked her to the parking garage and waited while she loaded the box into her trunk, then drove away without comment. Sarah sat in her car in the Riverside Community parking garage at 6:04 a.m. with the engine off and her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. The rain from earlier had stopped, leaving the concrete slick and reflecting the fluorescent lights from the garage ceiling. She could see her own face in the rearview mirror, the same face that had commanded the trauma bay, that had compressed a Green Beret's heart back to life, that had recognized something impossible 17 years after the Hindu Kush. She'd failed the mission. 2 years of cover evaporated in 90 seconds of direct cardiac massage. She'd failed Marcus twice in one lifetime. And she couldn't even turn the key because there was no point, because everything she'd built was ash, because the Pentagon would already know her cover was blown the moment Gabriel's call to Dr. Voss reached the hospital board, which would cross-reference with military contacts, which would trigger alerts at naval intelligence, which would end with her being recalled to active duty or worse, being charged with unauthorized medical practice, because her real credentials would surface and contradict everything her civilian identity claimed to be. The parking garage was empty except for maintenance vehicles in the far corner. The rain smell hung in the air, ozone and wet concrete and something like diesel fuel. Sarah's breathing was controlled, measured, military precise. Not the breath of someone braking. The breath of someone waiting. And that's when her phone vibrated on the passenger seat. The parking garage at Riverside Community smelled like diesel exhaust and defeat. Sarah sat motionless behind the steering wheel, her badge deactivated on the passenger seat, the plastic rectangle catching the fluorescent light like a discarded artifact from someone else's life. Her hands rested at 10 and 2. Engine off. Keys in her lap. She had infiltrated 3 war zones, extracted wounded under fire, carried a child through 10 miles of hostile terrain, and she couldn't turn an ignition because what was the point when the mission had collapsed and Marcus Webb had gone unhelped twice in one lifetime, separated by 20 years and her own inability to maintain cover when it mattered most. Rain hammered the concrete above like applause for a performance nobody wanted to witness. 6 a.m. The graveyard shift nurses would be clocking out now, filing past security, carrying their secrets. The reassigned nurses, Jennifer, Michael, Susan, were probably sitting in their cars too, wondering if their altered incident reports would matter, if speaking the truth had been worth the professional exile. Gabriel had won. The strategic competence that made him so much more dangerous than a simple bully had calculated every angle, every ally, every paper trail that would lead to her dismissal. The opioid trafficking investigation would go dormant. The ring connecting 3 states would dissolve back into operational silence. And she had accelerated it by saving Marcus's life. The passenger window tapped. Once. Twice. Sarah's head didn't move, but her eyes shifted. A shadow against the rain-streaked glass. 16-year-old shoulders. Daniel. Her son held something rectangular against his chest like an artifact he'd been forbidden to touch, the shadow box. The one buried in her closet for 17 years. The one she'd explicitly told him never to open. Mom. His voice came muffled through the glass. They need to see these. Sarah's hand moved to the door handle with the mechanical precision of someone operating on empty. The door opened. The rain came sideways, cold on her scrubs. Daniel stood there soaked, his hoodie plastered to his narrow frame, and in his hands, her navy cross. Her silver star. Catching the parking garage lights like they were burning a hole through reality. How? Sarah said. One word. Not a question. The dog tag. He held up the broken chain, Marcus Webb Sr.'s identification visible even in the rain. The one you keep by your bed. The emergency contact number was updated. I called. I called and told them you were, his voice cracked. I told them you were in trouble. The rain fell harder. Somewhere inside Riverside Community, Marcus Webb was waking up, alive because she had cracked his chest and held his failing heart in her hands. The same Marcus whose father she couldn't save. The same boy she had carried out of the Hindu Kush as an 8-year-old with his father's blood on her uniform. Sarah didn't move. Didn't speak. Just took the shadow box from her son's shaking hands and looked at the medals inside, 2 pieces of metal that represented 847 lives extracted under fire, 3 combat tours through hell, and the fact that some secrets, once released, could never be contained again. Come on, she said quietly. We're going back inside. The hospital lobby had transformed within an hour. It wasn't a transformation, it was a collapse of normal into something else entirely. The Marine Corps liaison stood at the information desk in dress blues, his posture a vertical line of military bearing. Behind him, hospital staff gathered in clusters, their voices low but electric with a kind of energy that precedes a shift in power. The administrator had already arrived. The board chairman was on his way. The news was still 10 minutes out, but the information vector was already moving, spreading through staff channels like a viral infection nobody could stop. Marcus Webb stood by the trauma bay entrance in a hospital gown, unsteady on his feet, but vertical. Conscious. Alive. The cardiothoracic team had cleared him for observation. The direct cardiac massage had held long enough for the on-call surgeon to stabilize his migrated bone fragment and repair the cardiac wall. Sarah's battlefield medicine had bridged the gap between death and survival. When Marcus saw her, his eyes went still. Recognition moved across his face like a wave, not immediate, but building. His lips moved. One word, whispered loud enough to carry, Valkyrie. The room went so quiet the ventilators sounded like the only things still breathing. The Marine Corps liaison stepped forward with a folder that looked military official, crisp and sealed and heavy with institutional weight. He opened it and began reading, his voice carrying the precision of someone trained to transmit information that could reshape careers, decisions, lives. Master Chief Sarah Chen, Navy designation Valkyrie, successfully extracted 12 wounded under fire in Helmand Province, Sanjin Valley Sector, October 2003. Extraction occurred under sustained small arms fire from fortified positions. One civilian miner, age 8, incorporated into extraction after father sustained fatal cardiac injury during initial engagement. Master Chief Chen provided direct medical intervention to cardiac casualty using available field supplies and manual resuscitation. Civilian miner successfully evacuated. 12 military personnel successfully evacuated. 0 casualty rate on extraction team. He paused. This action was performed in violation of forward operating base protocols, under direct fire, with ongoing medical crisis. Master Chief Chen was awarded the Navy Cross for this action in 2004. Daniel stood holding the decorations, his hands perfectly steady now, understanding somehow that this moment required him to be the pillar his mother had always been. The medal stood in his palms, Navy Cross first, because of precedence. Silver Star second. Both of them catching the lobby lights. A 2-star general entered through the emergency bay doors. Full dress blues. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He crossed the lobby with the fluid precision of someone who had moved through decades of institutional hierarchy and come out the other side still breathing. He stood before Sarah, not speaking, just moving his hand to his brow in a salute that belonged to someone who understood what sacrifice actually meant. The general's phone rang. He answered it, listened for 6 seconds, then put it on speaker. The voice came through the hospital lobby, institutional, formal, originating from the Pentagon Strategic Medical Command. This is Pentagon Strategic Medical Command requesting confirmation of location for Master Chief Sarah Chen, operational designation Valkyrie. She has been requested for immediate presidential recognition of her role in Operation Copper Valley. Transportation will arrive within the hour. Do not confirm to uncleared personnel. The line went dead. Dr. Gabriel pushed through the crowd near the trauma bay entrance, his face a construction of calculation trying to reorient itself toward a new threat assessment. His mouth opened, words about jurisdiction and protocol already forming, already weaponized, but the 2-star general turned toward him with the kind of look that exists in the space between pity and contempt. Dr. Gabriel. Not a question. The general's voice carried the weight of someone who had sat in classified briefings about this exact hospital, this exact situation, this exact moment. You attempted to restrict the movements of a Master Chief Petty Officer performing her lawful duties. You filed false critical incident reports. You systematically reassigned nursing staff who could corroborate her medical decisions. That's institutional retaliation against a decorated military operative. The FBI will have questions. The silence was so complete you could hear the rain outside. Gabriel's jaw moved without sound. The crowd around them had grown, hospital staff, security, patients who had heard the emergency codes and come to watch the moment when authority restructured itself around truth. A janitor in the back of the crowd was filming on his phone. Sarah watched him, understood the trajectory. This would be on YouTube within 2 hours, the footage of Gabriel's face in the moment he comprehended the disaster he'd constructed. The video of a man realizing he had spent 18 months destroying someone he had no authority to touch. Within 4 hours, the video had 47,000 views. By 8 p.m., it had reached Dr. Patricia Voss, Gabriel's former medical school mentor, the woman who had placed him at Riverside Community, who had written his recommendation letters, who had built his career through her board connections and institutional weight. By 9 p.m., Dr. Voss had released a statement, "I am appalled to learn that a former protege of mine demonstrated such egregious failure of judgment and character. I am personally requesting an emergency board review and withdrawing my sponsorship of Dr. Gabriel's departmental leadership." The board review took 4 days. Sarah testified about Gabriel's calls to allies, his documentation of every action, his systematic reassignment of witness staff. Jennifer, Michael, and Susan submitted statements from their new shifts at other hospitals, testimony about the pressure to alter their incident reports, about being reassigned for speaking the truth. Gabriel's competence became his downfall because he had documented everything. Every call. Every strategic move. Every calculated action designed to isolate her, undermine her, destroy her professional reputation, it all existed now in institutional paperwork that proved not her guilt, but his malice. The board terminated his employment within 6 hours of closing testimony. Revoked his departmental privileges. Flagged his medical license for review by the state board. By the time the decision was finalized, Gabriel had already submitted his resignation letter and disappeared from Riverside Community with the speed of someone who understood that his position was no longer tenable, his reputation no longer salvageable, his career no longer something he could control. 6 months later, Marcus Webb visited Sarah at her new position, director of the VA's PTSD Innovation Program in Denver. He stood in her office doorway in civilian clothes, a coffee cup in his hands, his green beret bearing the insignia of someone who had moved from combat to purpose. "I saw him yesterday," Marcus said quietly. "Dr. Gabriel. He was driving a medical supply van across town. Couldn't look at me." Sarah nodded, feeling no triumph, only the weight of what vindication costs when you're the one who had to survive it. She touched the dog tag hanging outside her uniform now, Marcus Webb Sr.'s name engraved where anyone could see it. Where it belonged. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said. The words came not as statement, but as teaching. As foundation. As the principle around which she had rebuilt her life and the lives of veterans who came to her program carrying their own versions of Marcus's father, the losses that never quite become memory. The White House East Room held its breath the day Sarah stood there in her dress uniform, Master Chief anchors gleaming against the fabric. Daniel stood on her left wearing his father's navy pins, a detail that had emerged in conversations with Marcus, understanding now what Sarah had never directly stated, that Daniel's father had been the helicopter pilot who died returning for the Hindu Kush extraction, and that Sarah had carried that loss in silence for 20 years while raising a son who would one day hold her medals and change everything. Marcus Webb stood on her right in his green beret dress uniform, and they were both wearing the same dog tags around their necks, Marcus Webb Sr.'s identification engraved on both, connecting 3 generations of sacrifice across 2 decades. The president shook Sarah's hand, pinned the Defense Distinguished Service Medal to her chest, and mentioned the hospital incident without saying Gabriel's name. Master Chief Chen's actions under fire weren't limited to foreign battlefields, they continued in a Denver hospital where institutional barriers tried to stop her from saving a life. The photograph captured all 3 of them, this family bound by loss and salvation across 20 years. The image reached Dr. Gabriel in his apartment where he sat surrounded by framed credentials that meant nothing now, knowing that this photograph would outlast every reputation he had built, every institutional power he had wielded, every careful strategic move he had made. The transformation was complete. Sarah had moved from night shift nurse back to Master Chief. From invisibility to recognition. From surviving in shadows to standing in light where her son and the boy she had saved could finally understand the full weight of what she carried, what she had always been, and what she would become next. If you've made it this far, you already know the truth. Heroes don't wear capes, and they rarely announce themselves before they save your life. Subscribe for more stories about the one society underestimated. Like and comment if you've ever been judged by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to. And if you know a Sarah Chen, someone quietly carrying sacrifices nobody can see, tell them thank you. Because the world turns on people like that.